Now, Rick Townsend, he's an old hand here, right? Rick, I talked last week about local apologists, and Rick is kind of the prototypical local apologist. He not only um, got so involved in apologetics and defending the Christian faith that he went back and got a PhD. So highly educated, but also local. He goes to 121 Church. Jason Gardner's in the same category. Apologist in terms of wanting to understand the Christian faith better, wanting to defend its accuracy and its truth. And Jason has been studying for well over 20 years, and you're going to really enjoy the presentation that both these guys give tonight. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit and talk a little bit of how they got into this, okay? But I want to do two things first. I'll pray. I will pray, but before that, I talked to the student today in the union, and it reminded me, and this will be especially appropriate for those students who really weren't here much in the fall, that what we do every week here is one slice of Christian apologetics. It's a topic because it's all we can kind of handle in 1 week in one presentation. But it's building a cumulative case for Christianity. And I talked to a student today, and he's interested in the topics, but he's a little bit skeptical that any one topic proves Christianity. First of all, we don't use the word prove, right? Because we are finite and fallible creatures, right? We can't necessarily prove the high intelligence of a God, right, to the satisfaction of many people in this world, and that's why faith is required, right? But on the other hand, it's not a blind faith, right? And it's a cumulative case. And so what you're hearing tonight is another part of that cumulative case. Last week we talked about beauty as evidence of God and a supernatural force, right, that goes beyond us. Next week, we're going to talk about music in that same category. Ray Franks is going to teach on that. So these are all slices of the evidential argument for why Christianity is true. It's a cumulative case. So let's remember it in that way. Let me kick off with a prayer, and then we'll get going. All right. Heavenly Father, you are so good and gracious. You display the works of your creation to us on a second by second basis, Lord. And you really gave us an opportunity to see some new visions and perceptions and angles of space most recently. Lord, we thank you for giving us our creative nature. We thank you for letting us discover gradually how you created and how you manage and operate. Lord, bless tonight Rick and Jason as they share wisdom and science with us and piece together one more bit of the evidential argument for Christianity as truth, Lord. Be with them, be with us. We ask this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Amen. All right, take it away. Okay. Give it up for Rick.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is one of my favorite places to come because it's a really well-educated audience, and even those of you who are new to this group probably have some background in this topic, or you wouldn't be here. So this is not about me, but I'll introduce myself real briefly. I'm a retired Air Force fighter pilot and airline pilot, flew several Century Series aircraft, and then did 2 tours in the F-15. Went to the airlines and spent 28 years with American Airlines, and then as a reservist, got to work on the F-22 program and the acquisition side. So I've got a fair amount of exposure to airplanes, and my interest in this topic really started when I was about 23, which is a long time ago. Over 50 years ago, just you can do the math. But I got interested in evidence for our faith, and it's been a nonstop interest ever since. So tonight, we're going to look at evidence for the flood. So let me just set the stage, and then we'll dive in. So that video kind of hopefully sets the stage for the fact that this was a serious event. It was not mythology, it's history. When we read the narrative in the Bible, which we'll do tonight, and then we look at the evidence in science, we can find that the science corroborates what the Bible narrates. But frequently in our society, we're shown a different picture of it. We see something like this, where they compare it to high-speed rail as kind of a silly idea. Or we'll see it in children's literature, typically in a picture like this, where it's cute animals on a tranquil sea in a small boat. This is not the narrative we're going to tell tonight. So Jason and I have been doing this research for a long time. He may not tell you as much about you as I'd like to tell him, but he's been a tenacious researcher, especially in the last few years. He's read probably 100 books on the flood. Is probably one of the premier experts, in my opinion, on this topic. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have two parts. I'm going to do the first half, and he's going to do the second half. I'm going to give you the big picture. We'll talk about the historic narrative as it's recorded in the Bible. We'll talk about dinosaurs. We'll talk about some ideas about when this all happened and what the human interaction was. We'll talk about how we date things with carbon-14 and radiometric dating. And I'll give you some ideas about a flood timeline that may make more sense than what you've been told before. So I'll outline that stuff, and then Jason's going to come up and give some specific scientific proofs, more data point, more granular, if you will, on some specific points. That's our big picture for tonight. And then we'll do some Q&A. Bob will come up, and you'll be free to go home. So if anybody wants to leave now, that's what you're in for. If you don't want it, we'll see you later. But I hope you'll stay. So we'll start with biblical clues. I'll give you a little bit of, again, big picture on archaeological and geological clues and talk about fossils. So let's dive into it with the biblical clues of what the Bible says and what we're looking for in the science. So what it says is, we have this account in Genesis. I won't read all the words here, but you can kind of skim them. When we have Adam and Eve being created in the garden, there is this account of what happened and what the situation was like when God created. There's no shrubs in the field, no plants. The Lord had not sent rain, no man to work the ground. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed life into him as a living being. That's the story. That's the narrative. Two key points for our purposes. One, the Lord had not sent rain. So apparently in this period of Earth history, there was no rain. There was a meteorological situation in which rain was not a factor. And instead, streams or mists came up from the earth to water the vegetation. So that might have been springs, it might have been streams that were flowing out of underground aquifers or whatever. But there was no rain. So the first time we see rain mentioned in the scripture will be in what's coming up next. So before we get to what's next, we get to why this event happened. So why did the flood happen? And the reason the flood happened was that the earth was corrupt in the sight of God. The earth was filled with violence. God looked, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. That's a pretty devastating description. But it goes on. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. Pretty devastating sentence being pronounced on the earth and its inhabitants. So the next thing that happens in the narrative is that Noah is told to build an ark. Now this happens when Noah is 500 years old. We believe that before the flood, it's very likely that humans lived longer, possibly because there was a different atmospheric condition that shielded radiation, possibly because of a change in biology. We don't know for sure, but it seems like the humans lived a lot longer before the flood than they did afterwards. So Noah's 500 years old. He becomes the father of 3 sons, and about the same time, he's told how to make this ark. God's already told him he's going to flood the earth, and now he's going to give him a description. So make yourself an ark. And then he gets some really specific descriptions about this boat. It's going to be 450 feet long, gives all the dimensions, tells about how high the roof is. The roof's only going to be 18 inches by our 1 cubit above the deck. So put a door in the side, make 3 decks, really specific. This is a big boat. This is a football field and a half. Have any been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? It's a pretty impressive display, and it gives you the idea that this thing is actually feasible. Definitely worthwhile taking a look at, but a really big boat. I can't make it big enough on the screen, but that's the best I can do. But moving along, he says, you will enter the ark, you, your sons, don't forget your wife and kids. That's kind of important. And he says, then you're going to bring a bunch of animals, all living creatures, 2 of each kind. And this is where I hate to break it to you, but there was one kind of animal, namely unicorns, were not included in the ark. Okay, so spoiler alert, no unicorns. And then he said, by the way, pack a lunch. You're going to be there a while. And so take every kind of food. And so he packs this picnic basket, but it's a big picnic basket. It's interesting to me that Abraham is really praised for how much faith he had because God told him that he was going to leave this land, go someplace else without telling him where. And so we're told he had great faith, which he did. Noah was told, I'm going to wipe everything out. You're going to build a boat to sustain yourself through that period. And I'm not telling you how long you're going to be on the boat, but pack a lunch. So I think Noah had incredible faith to do this because the next thing it says is Noah did everything just as God commanded him. May that be said of all of us, right? Okay. So moving along, God says, 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. I'll wipe every living creature I've made from the surface of the earth. Kind of a big deal. So we're going to have a timeline. As we go along, I'm going to show you kind of what's happening at different points. This is going to be the years of Noah's life. You can see, if you're close enough to the front, you can probably see the numbers, but that's 600 on the left, 601, 601st year on the right. And spoiler alert, he's going to be on this boat for a year. Think about that. A wooden boat that you build to hold all these animals with your lunch, and you're going to be there a year. Okay. So we're going to have a little bit of a depiction of the terrain along the bottom just to kind of keep you on track. And we'll, as we go along, the timing will be in orange boxes and the event will be in yellow highlights. So that's kind of the color code as we go forward. So here we are in the 600th year of Noah's life. That's our timing cue. 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth. So this sounds like there was a subterranean ocean of some kind that at some point God released that ocean with tectonic plate cracks, possibly through volcanoes or earthquakes. We don't know specifically. Maybe it was the famed asteroid that hit the earth. Who knows? God could have used that to trigger these events. We don't really know. But the springs of the great deep burst forth. So you've got these springs coming forward. We'll talk about that in a second. But it says, and the next thing is the floodgates of the heavens were opened. So the first thing is the water comes from underneath, and the second thing is it comes from up above. So as the springs go down, the water goes up, and the land actually falls probably a little bit as the waters come out from underneath that area. Okay? So now we got 40 days after that, the waters keep increasing, probably from both directions. And as they increase, it says it lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose greatly, and it uses that phrase twice, which is kind of means they're really serious. It says they rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heaven were covered to a depth of 20 feet. So in our graphic now, everything's underwater. And so this is how this might have looked. As you have these tectonic plates splitting and pressing down on this subterranean ocean, the water explodes out of this crevice and would have formed incredibly high water spewing out into the atmosphere. That may have been what changed the meteorological conditions such that now it can produce rain. It may also have reduced the atmospheric pressure. That's one of the ideas, is that the atmospheric pressure changed such that that's maybe one of the reasons the dinosaurs didn't live beyond this point, is that they couldn't survive in the lower atmospheric pressure with the large body mass. But this massive amount of water would have caused tsunami-sized tidal waves that we can't imagine, hundreds of feet high, encroaching onto the continents and overwhelming everything on dry land. The mountains probably were not as high back then. We'll talk about how they probably formed. But the mechanics of this are unknown, but we have some clues. And it does suggest that this tectonic plate movement may have been one of the keys that God used to trigger it. So let's look at another depiction of kind of how this looks. So you've got the waters coming from these explosions under the plate and moving toward the continent.
The 6 megasequences, but they differ on the timescale in which they happened. If they took millions of years, then they have little to do with the flood. But if they were all deposited rapidly and recently, then the flood should come to mind. Many also question when a larger landmass, such as a Pangea-like supercontinent, broke into continents that moved to their current configuration. For the first time ever, new megasequence maps allow us to see how the flood shaped our entire planet, just like the Bible said, including reconfiguring the continents.
So as these waters were released and began with the tsunami force going up onto the land, at some point they reached higher ground and would have sloshed back. Think about tidal action. As they do that, all this sediment that's being torn up from the edges of the tectonic plates are being dragged up onto the land and then washed in the other direction. That's what they're calling a mega sequence. And as you get different parts of the tectonic plates having the same effect, where one area is swept one direction, an area from another tectonic plate explosion is flowing back the other direction, you get different sequences and different types of bedrock that are forming these layers. And these are called mega sequences. And all geologists agree that there are 6 mega sequences. They just don't agree on where they came from. So that's what they mean there. So there is, at the edge of these plates, there is a region where the plates meet and they separate, and magma is actually released, and that's called a subduction zone. So take a look at what this might have looked like.
Today, these subduction zones form the ring of fire, responsible for over 90% of our earthquakes.
So we have this ring of fire. You've probably all heard of it. Mainly we hear about it in the Pacific, but if you look at it, it's all over the deep oceans and even on some of the continents. And again, what happens is at some point, these plates, as they're moving apart and the magma is coming out and all that sort of thing, eventually that cools, and then where that cools, the land shrinks and goes down. But where the tectonic plates are moving toward each other, they actually overlap and begin pushing each other up. And that's where we get our higher mountain ranges, such as the Rockies, the Andes, the Alps. On every continent, you see this same phenomenon that looks like this one event is a way to explain how these high mountains came about.
When God stopped the fountains of the Great Deep on day 150, the new ocean surface began cooling and sinking, allowing the floodwaters to lower as they sheeted off the continents into the new ocean basins. Psalm 104 describes the mountains being raised at the end of the flood, and the waters draining down valleys and off the emerging new land surfaces. The seafloor rifting process and the resulting mountain forming process explains why sea creatures are found on mountaintops all over the world, high above current sea levels.
So again, the fossils of these shells would have been formed during the early flood stages with sediment covering them and then encasing them in rock, and then the tectonic plates being pushed up together and exposing them in certain areas, like we see even in the Himalayas. The highest mountain ranges have these fossil deposits. So that's kind of a combination of the big picture of geology and the narrative. But let's go back to the narrative and see what else it says. So God remembered Noah, the springs of the deep, the floodgates of the heavens are closed, the rain stops falling, the water begins receding, and at the end of 150 days, which is now the 7th month, if you do the math, 5 months after the first event, which is the 2nd month, 17th day. Now we're the 7th month, 17th day. The water had gone down, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So 7 months into this thing, or five months into this thing, the ark begins to settle onto some kind of solid ground. But it's not time to get out yet. Okay, the waters continued to recede till the 10th month of the first day, and at that point, now we start to see the tops of the mountains become visible. So now we're another couple months farther down the road, and we start seeing, again, the ark is going to settle on a mountain, and we're going to see these mountain tops become visible from the ark. It's interesting, I'm not sure exactly why the ark comes to rest so early, and it's later that we see mountaintops, perhaps in the distance is what they're talking about there. But that's, again, we're a long ways into this year on the boat. So as the flood continues as the water continues to settle into the deeper areas, after another 40 days, Noah sends out a dove, and it comes back with nothing because it can't find any place to land. And then 7 more days, he sends it out, the water's receded, and the dove brings back an olive branch, which means things have started growing. So there's starting to be some stability reforming. And then we have another period that happens. He waited 7 more days, sent the dove out again. This time it did not return to him. So we have 3 more data points, a couple weeks apart in the 11th month. but we still don't get out of the boat because you have just been through a massive series of volcanoes, earthquakes, flood, and you ain't going out there yet because it's scary out there. Okay, I get that. So they stay in the boat, and the flood ends by the first day of the first month of Noah's 600th and first year. The water had dried up. And then the 27th day of the second month, almost 2 months after that, the earth was completely dry. And at that point, God says, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and your wives. Like, it's okay. You can leave your life preservers behind. It's time to get out of the boat. And so that's the time period in which we see this entire flood narrative going along. So God specifies, the question next is was it regional? Because we're frequently told it was just a regional flood, just a little area of the earth. And I want to look at the language and see if the language allows for that. So God says he's going to wipe from the face of the earth every living creature. He talks about high mountains, living things on the face of the earth, specifically animals, creatures, birds, mankind. And he uses some real specific language, only Noah. So any of you remember when you were in English class in junior high, they said don't use superlatives. Never use never or always, because there's always an exception, right? God's not afraid of superlatives. So when he says every living creature, all the high mountains, everything on dry ground, every living thing, only Noah, there's not really any wiggle room. In fact, if you look at this, everybody want to speed read this? This is a chapter and a half from 7:11 to 8:24 of Genesis. And I've highlighted the superlatives in this passage. There are 27 times that he uses the terms every, always, everything, only. So my question to you is, well, I'll ask the question in a second. Just this one short passage. Look at this. All the high mountains under the entire heavens. Every living thing that moved on the face, covered the mountains with more than 20 feet. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished, birds, livestock, etc., creatures, mankind. Everything on dry land, every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left. The question is, do you think that there's any room in here for this being a regional flood as far as the way the Bible describes it? It doesn't look like it to me, okay? So for people that claim it's a regional flood, my first question is, does the Bible allow for that? And the second question will be, what does the evidence show? So I'm going to run really quickly through some geological examples, and we're going to look at geology and anthropology. Geology first. There are three kinds of rocks. Anybody take geology before? Okay. So igneous rocks are volcanic. They come from volcanoes, magma, all that kind of stuff. Metamorphic rock is heat and pressure deep in the earth. That's marble, quartz, schist, those kinds of slate is one of those. And then there's sedimentary rock. That's the most common rock. In fact, it's so common that you almost never encounter any other kind of rock. You have to look for the other kinds of rock. On the crust of the earth, above the magma, we have 95% is not sedimentary rock. But at the surface, 95% or 75% of the rock is sedimentary. It had to come from somewhere, folks. Sedimentary rock is known to have been deposited out of water. Where'd all the water come from if there was not a flood to account for it? And yet it covers a huge amount. This is North America. All the yellow stuff is sedimentary. This is the world's oceans. All the colors of various kinds are different kinds of sedimentary deposits on the ocean floor. This is what we see frequently when we go to various areas in the Northwest U.S., Southwest Arizona, etc. You can see the banding. It's sedimentary rock, and it's thousands of feet thick. Where do you get thousands of feet of sediment unless there's a major event to cause it? This is Colorado, a mountainous state. All the red is sedimentary. We know the power of water, but we don't think about it very often. When we have the floods in South Texas, we kind of think about it. But look at the power of water in a small area. This is a mud flow area, and it's just going to throw these vehicles around like they're tinker toys. This is a landslide. Anything in its path is going to be destroyed. And these are glaciers, a major factor in previous ages of the earth. And these things completely reshape the landmass. This is a glacier I took a picture of in Greenland. These are active glaciers still around today, in spite of the fact that they are receding. They've been receding ever since the flood and the ice age that followed the flood because of the cooling of the flood itself. That's something we won't get into tonight. The ice age is an interesting topic. But how is it explained by geologists? Well, they say this idea of uniformitarianism. That means uniform, I believe it's uniform. Uniformism. And what that means is things have always occurred at the same rate, uniform rate. But do they? We have sediment miles deep with no sediment currently forming. So they don't form at a uniform rate. This is southwestern US. You see a lot of sedimentary rock. You see any sedimentary rock being deposited? Probably not. This is the Gobi Desert. Same thing. This is our area in Texas, and if we zoom out and go especially over to southwestern United States in the Phoenix area, what you can see is mountain ridge lines, and in between the ridge lines, lots of sediment has settled in between these ridge lines. It almost looks like they've kind of sifted things and it's kind of come off the mountain peaks, and in the valleys you see this flatter area where there are these sedimentary deposits. This is the same area from outer space, and another view of the Phoenix area from space. You can see the same thing where the sediment has dropped into the area between the ridge lines. Now this next picture looks just like the southwestern United States, same characteristics, but it's Afghanistan. This was taken from a U-2. I won't tell you that my son took the picture, but he was a U-2 pilot. You never know, could have been. And another picture of that same region. Again, you see sediment between ridge lines. It's a very typical characteristic that we see everywhere. This is that same region. Again, you can see lots of evidence of erosion, but no water. There's no massive water to cause it anymore. So where's the uniformitarianism? This is the Red Sea. Even here, you can see the sediments settled in between the mountain ridge lines. So again, we see these characteristics all over the place. This is the Grand Canyon. How many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? It's a phenomenal place, right? And it's all formed with water. It's now universally, I would say almost universally, acknowledged by geologists that there was an inland ocean that was trapped in an earthen dam. When this rock was still soft, the water flowed through this area and cut the rock. Why was it soft? Because it was recent. This is some of the effect that water can have in the Grand Canyon. This looks like the Grand Canyon, but it's in Namibia. Same characteristics. We can find the same types of characteristics in South America. This is in Peru. This is a region called Colca Canyon. It is twice as deep as the Grand Canyon. It's not as wide, but it's 10,000 feet deep, all sedimentary rock. This is another Grand Canyon, but this one is in China. They're on every continent. You can find these kinds of canyons because the same effect happened everywhere. So this is the central United States, all the way from Texas up through Canada and from Colorado to Ohio and farther east, this broad plain of incredibly fertile land, and it's all sedimentary rock. This is South Lake, Texas. We are sitting here in Denton on sedimentary rock, thousands of feet deep. So geology does not look like it was a regional flood. Now we also have this issue of fossils. Now you've all heard of fossils, you're probably aware of those. And in fossils, we find these incredible creatures buried, some of which are extinct. Trilobites and other creatures I can't even name. Here's a fish that's eating another fish caught in the act. This was not a gradual deposit. This was a sudden covering up of this fish eating another fish caught in the act. This is a dolphin giving birth. And then we have these guys, and these dinosaurs that kids love. Years ago, I don't know what year it was, how many of you watched the original Jurassic Park movie? It's very rare that you go to a movie and you find yourself in awe of God, especially when it came from Hollywood. But when I saw this scene that I'm going to play next, I just marveled, and I hope you did too.
This dinosaur. Only runs, war-body creature.
This thing doesn't know to swamp.
This thing's got what, 25 times that attack?
So do you remember that scene? Yeah. I still get chills when I watch it. These creatures actually lived. They actually did that stuff. And why does this guy look like this after he's just had this amazing experience? Because it's a Hollywood movie and he knows this is coming next. You got to have some dinosaurs eating people or there's just not a Hollywood movie to be made, right? All right. But that's probably not the way they behaved. But when did the dinosaurs live? That's the next question. So we typically see this idea of a geological column. And we're told that carbon dating helps us to date things, radiometric dating and the potassium argon and uranium lead. What is the geological column? Well, it's this idea that layers of strata were laid down and they give us a marker for when different animals existed. And we'll see these incredibly detailed charts. In fact, you'll see, so over here, you'll see dates with 4 degrees, 4 digits of accuracy. That's really accurate. If you see something that says 199.6, they really know what they're talking about, right? Except when you go to the next chart, it's different numbers. And I'm not going to go into real detail, but you can look this up later. It's really, they don't all have the same numbers. So before the bottom of the Cambrian was 570, here it's 542, but we got 4 digits of accuracy. We can't even get 1 digit right. What they do is they say, okay, these animals are found in these layers, and so therefore these layers are this old, and therefore when we find this fossil, it's that old as well. And what that means is you're dating the fossil by the shell and the shell by the fossil. And there's another term for this kind of reasoning. It's called circular. We don't have a good way to date these layers in spite of what you're told. So there's another way to look at this. When animals die, so if you have an animal like an elephant that dies in the Serengeti, what happens to it? It sits, what? Oh, no. It sits on the plain, it gets covered with dust and more dust, and eventually it turns into a fossil, right? No, that's not what happens. It has to be buried rapidly in a lot of mud so that it can then be encased and that rock can dry out and it can become a fossil. So think about what if this works a different way? What if instead we had an event like the flood and the animals that were less mobile were basically buried where they were? And so we have at the bottom here, we have shellfish. They're not going to move very far. They're going to be buried in the first sediment deposits that happen. Then you're going to get more mobile animals like fish and things that can swim, and they'll be a little farther away. And the farther up you go, the more you get what we call complex animals. Have you ever seen an octopus? This is not a simple animal. None of the animals are simple. The bivalve shellfish are not simple creatures. And so these creatures, I think the better explanation is, as the floodwaters and the chaos is happening, especially the land animals move away from the rising water as fast as they can, and that's why we find them all together buried in fossil graveyards. Regions of the United States have millions or perhaps billions of bones and millions of specimens, all buried together, all jumbled up. Incredible chaos, great devastation, great violence. So that's a better way to explain that. Carbon dating, we're typically told, well, we know how old things are by carbon dating. Well, the way carbon dating works is you have nitrogen that's bombarded the upper atmosphere, and a single proton is turned into a neutron and goes from nitrogen 14 to carbon 14. And over a period of 5,700 years, it gradually turns back into stable nitrogen. That's how carbon 14 is dated. Every creature, all of you have this. Is that a living plant? You have the same carbon 14 as that plant if it's alive. If it's plastic, it's not. That's game over. But if it's a living plant, every living thing has the same amount of proportion of carbon 14 to carbon 12. Over the next 5,700 years, you don't get millions of years out of carbon 14. Reputable scientists will say you might be able to get one half-life fairly accurately, but here's the other problem. We don't know exactly what the carbon ratio was, carbon 14 to carbon 12, when those creatures were buried. And so we're making assumptions that it's the same ratio as we have now, but we don't really have a good way to know because everything else that was buried at that point was buried at that point. And so whatever the situation was at that point, that's what we're finding to compare it to. And we don't know specifically what that date was. Nobody was taking notes. When Noah was able to bury these, when these things were buried in the flood, we don't know exactly what the conditions were from which they were buried. So that's the problem. Real quick, we're not going to, again, unknown starting point. This is another issue. We've found dinosaur bones, especially large dinosaur bones that we're told lived 6,500 years ago, with soft tissue that can't last 65 million years. And there's all kinds of explanations they try to give. Well, there were special conditions that preserved this soft tissue for 65 million years. They're going to cling to their 65 million years instead of questioning the assumptions. I'm not going to go into any detail on radiometric dating except to say there's a lot of uncertainty about stable decay rates. There are a lot of articles that cite these problems. This quote is helpful. There are so many complicated phenomena to consider that it calls the whole radiometric dating scheme into question. And the title of that was More Bad News for Radiometric Dating. It was in a reputable journal from a major U.S. university. So the question is, did we coexist with dinosaurs? Well, let me ask you this. What's a dinosaur? It's a reptile, right? If I told you I was going to describe a dinosaur, or I was going to describe a dinosaur 18 feet long, incredibly tough scales, and it's huge mouth, huge teeth, would you call that a dinosaur? I'd call it a crocodile. We still have dinosaurs today. They just haven't all died out. Many of them have died out. But we have in human history lots of stories. If you look at the idea of dragons and you look it up online, you'll find incredible numbers of dragon narratives. They can't all be made up. A lot of them are from disparate communities that didn't talk to each other. So what we have here is we have Asian dragons, and then, not to be outdone, we have European dragons, and there's a long list of those. And then we have a list of individual dragons that are there. We have stories of. One of which down here you've probably heard of is this guy, St. George the Dragon Slayer. He was in the 4th century AD. It wasn't written about for several centuries later, so we don't have the original firsthand knowledge of what the eyewitness might have seen. But the point is that we have lots of narratives that look like these large reptiles existed well into the age when we have recorded history. Probably not the big ones, the things like T-Rex, and the ones that were so big they couldn't survive the lower atmospheric conditions. T-Rex was probably hunted into extinction if he survived after the arc. Those guys were dangerous and probably didn't last too long. We have stories, and again, I'll just encourage you to go to Job 40 and beyond, where we hear about Behemoth, and it's a tail like a cedar. That's not an elephant. We have Leviathan, which is a waterborne, looks like a dragon type thing, or dinosaur. And we have this description that's incredibly detailed and is not like any creature we've seen today. Again, I'm going to run through this real quick. There's this thing called out-of-place artifacts, and it's so common, there's an acronym for it. It's called OOP-ART. You've probably never heard of it, but if you Google it, you'll find, nobody's Googling anymore. We're AI searching now. But you'll find lots of references on this, and examples would include an iron hammerhead that's buried in sedimentary rock. These items were found in coal deposits, a metal bowl and a metal bell with some kind of an icon on it. So we have these examples. So the conclusions from this section: the flood was almost, I'll just say it, in my opinion, the flood was likely worldwide and catastrophic. Flood sediment occurred likely after humans were on the scene. The biblical narrative suggests that, I would suggest the biblical narrative is supported by the evidence, and that the evidence is worldwide. And so with that in mind, I'm going to ask Jason to come up. We'll trade places, and you got it.
All right. And cool. Thank you guys for having me. Just 30, 60 seconds about me and the flood, and just a little background about Jason. When I was a happy atheist at 20, somebody gave me a Bible, a nice young lady, and said, you should read this. If you really think this is a myth, then, to build your case, you should at least read the book. And so that night I started reading it, right? Game on. And if you read the Bible from cover to cover, you start at Genesis. So I read through the first couple pages and got to chapter 6 of Genesis pretty quick, probably that first or second night. Well, as a good Christian, that person gave me their email address if I had any questions. So my first question as a happy atheist was, hey, I'm reading your Bible to prove it wrong, and it talks about this global flood, catastrophic, kills everything except 8. Do you believe this really happened? I read that, and that's what I came to the conclusion that's what the Bible was talking about. And that Christian 25 years ago told me, Jason, whenever I'm reading some sort of nonfiction, I always give the author the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. That's what I would recommend you do with any book you read. And so from that point on, even as a happy atheist, I gave the author of Scripture the benefit of the doubt that the event did happen as described in Scripture and that it was global and catastrophic. That was 25 years ago. Within a couple of months, I became a Christian. I was saved. And from that point on, I've just been on fire for Christ. But more recently, I've been looking at the evidence because 25 years ago, as a young Christian, I heard about all these evidences that supported the creation event of the flood. But it was evangelists and pastors that were talking about this, but it wasn't scientists. So when I would talk to my skeptical friends about this, they would say, what scientists or what sort of peer-reviewed documents are you citing? What are your sources? And I didn't have any. It wasn't until more recently that I stumbled across a number of credentialed PhD scientists that have done field research in this area and have, I think, very stunning evidence to support things like the flood. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. But before I go into that, I want to look a little bit about perspective. This is one of my favorite words in the English language. Has anybody seen a chart like this, the Adam to Joseph, the age charts? You can actually download them from the Google. There's many of these. I'm a very visual learner, so if I can see something, it helps me learn and retain information. And so what we see here is people like Adam, Seth, and Enos. These guys lived a long, long time, hundreds of years. It begs the question, that me and Rick are talking about. Did these people actually live hundreds of years? Well, Scripture says they did. And if you look at this chart, they lived for hundreds of years until a massive event happened, the flood. And then after that, the ages of lifespan really start to teeter off. So something happened there. But something that's really, I think, very fascinating in Genesis is in Genesis chapter 47, specifically verses 8 and 9. This is where Joseph is the right-hand man to Pharaoh in Egypt. And Joseph has his dad come visit him in Egypt. Jacob is standing before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, hello, how are you? Nicey nice. Wait a minute. How old are you, Jacob? Seems like an odd question. And the response is even more odd, I think. Jacob says, who, me? I'm 130 years old. But my forefathers lived way longer than me. Interesting. That's in chapter 47. A little bit of perspective there. Now let's dig into the science. So first of all, I'm going to talk about 7 different evidences that support the global flood event. If I had several hours tonight to speak, I could speak to over 50 different evidences, but we're going to narrow it to just 7. The first one is we're going to cover sedimentation and specifically time and rate. So this is a flume experiment conducted in a lab by ICR. And what you can see here is when you have sediment in water, fast-moving water, you start to have layering or a sedimentation event, which creates strata. That's what the geologists call it. So you can see in less than 30 seconds, strata is forming in fast-moving water. This is how layers of strata would have been laid down during the flood. Again, I'm a very visual learner. Now, here we've got a lady at the bottom of this rock canyon for scale, and a traditional secular uniformitarian scientist, a geologist, would say that each inch of that sediment that was laid down in either a lake or a placid sea, a calm sea, it would take several tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, or maybe even millions of years for all that sediment to slowly trickle down to the bottom and then to layer or laminate. And so something like this, that structure of rock, would have taken millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of years to form. Not so. Check this out. In fact, there's actually 3 layers there that were laid down. The first layer at the bottom was laid down in about 12 hours in May 18th, 1980. The second layer followed June 12th, 1980, was laid down in about 10 to 12 hours as well. And then the final event happened about 2 years later. In just a couple of hours, that top layer was laid down in hours. it is radically different way of looking at it. But it gets even crazier because that same rock strata, when all of those events had happened at Mount St. Helens, finally there was an ice cap that melted, creating a mudslide that flowing water, flowing mud, cut through all of that rock in days and actually created an event that basically is a 1/40th scale of the Grand Canyon. That's what rapid flowing water can do. Not only it can create rapid sedimentation, but also it can remove large amounts of solid rock. Evidence number 2 is the Grand Canyon. Now, I saw when Rick asked about who's been to the Grand Canyon, about half of us said we've been to the Grand Canyon. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't been there yet, you gotta go. I've been there twice. The first time I went, it's one of the only times in my life where a landscape literally took my breath away. Unbelievable. How many of us have been taught or told in culture that the little river at the bottom of that canyon, the Colorado River, formed the Grand Canyon? I know I was taught my whole life about that. Well, did you know that geologists do not teach that anymore? And science books don't teach, well, science books still do teach it, but the actual geologists don't believe it anymore. In fact, they have a term for this. It's called an underfit river. So this is Dr. Neller. He has a PhD in geomorphology, really smart guy. He studies massive floods all over the planet and other planets. And this is how he defines an underfit river. It's a river that looks like a river is out of place. In other words, it does not look large enough to have created the valley in which it sits. So it seems there's an inconsistency with the volume of water of the flood flows and the shape of the valley. So what he's saying is that river cannot create that canyon that's 18 miles north to south and 270 miles east to west. It wasn't the river that did that. The canyon created the river. It's completely the opposite way of looking at it. And that's the way geologists look at canyon formation now. Evidence number 3 is there's no erosion in the strata. So when we look at strata, we can oftentimes see these very fine, what are called laminate lines in strata. And we can see massive lines as well. And what we tend to see, I'm going forward, let me go backwards. What we tend to see with these lines is if they happened over millions of years, for instance, then we would have water that would have carved out rivers and valleys. We would have had these edges. Okay, so just as a visual, you see the green line there, we should see all these indentations where water would have, over long periods of time, epochs, would have carved it out. But what we see instead is these layers of pancakes, or like a layer cake of different layers all over the globe. So you can see the different colors of rock strata. Or here's another example of me and the family. We're on top of the Ozark Mountains. So we're at elevation. And this behind us is all mud rock. It's sedimentary rock. The only way that can be laid down is by sediment that's suspended in water. So how can water get on top of the Ozark Mountains and lay all these different layers of mud rock? Maybe a global flood. Even in coal seams, you can see these seams of strata perfectly straight. There's no indentations. There should be indentations. We're back at the Grand Canyon. You can see at the top, the Coconino Sandstone. That line doesn't just go across the Grand Canyon, it goes across most of North America and continues on to other continents as well. This is not just a Grand Canyon thing. This is Dr. John Morris. He has a PhD in geology. He's since passed, but he would talk about the Coconino Sandstone all the time. He said the white Coconino Sandstone, thought by uniformitarians to be solidified desert sand dunes, here overlies the reddish Hermit Shale, that bottom red shale, a dildactic that's dated as 20 million years older. Now, if the dildactic was uplifted to host the desert, it would have undergone extensive erosion, but the flatness of the contact between the strata belies the interpretation. So that's technical jargon. What Dr. Morris is saying is, listen, look at the Hermit Shale and look at the Coconino above. It is razor line. There's no indentations. There should be. And you can see that Coconino Sandstone, that white sandstone, as far as the eye can see. Again, it's not just at the Grand Canyon. It covers most of North America. Me and my son, we like to go on lots of kayak trips. So whenever we go on the river, I'm always looking at the rock. I'm always looking for erosion indentations, and I never see them. We go all over the United States looking at national parks, and on our road trips, we see flat strata lines everywhere, not just in North America, but in other countries all over the world that we visited. And we see this in the oceans as well, so, by the beaches, and you see the straight rock strata. Again, no indentations, there's no erosion. Evidence number 4 is bent rock. So I want to introduce you to two PhD geologists, Dr. Snelling and Dr. Whitmore, two PhDs in geology. And they studied rocks that were bent. Now we all know if we have a slab of rock and we try and bend it, it doesn't end well, right? It shatters, it cracks. You cannot bend rock unless you're really strong. And if you are really strong and bend it, it doesn't end well. So this is in the Grand Canyon. They're studying this rock formation that's going along, and then you can see on the slide, it goes all the way up, about 90 degrees, straight up. But rock doesn't bend. This is what the geologists say. You can immediately see that the folds are so smooth that it seems intuitive that the folds have had to have occurred when soft. So there's only 2 times you can actually bend rock like this. Either one, it has to be treated very, very hot, okay, and then it basically bends like plastic. But when you treat rock with incredible heat, it actually changes the chemistry of the rock from sedimentary rock into metamorphic rock. The chemistry is different. So what these scientists wanted to do is they wanted to go into the Grand Canyon, take some rock samples, bring them back to the lab, and check the chemistry. Did the chemistry change? So they took 53 rocks out of the Grand Canyon with the Park Service permission, and that's a whole story unto itself, brought it back to the lab, studied it, and what they realized is that again and again, the rocks, the chemistry hadn't changed. So the secular scientists would say, oh, that bent rock there, it was because it was hot. It was really hot. No, that's not what the chemistry says. So the only other way you can bend rock is when it's been laid down wet and it's still soft and it can be pliable. Maybe a global flood. This doesn't just happen in the Grand Canyon. This is in France. That's super big rock that's been bent like plastic. And again, that's not metamorphic rock. It's still sedimentary rock. The chemistry has not changed. This is in England, in Cornwall. And look at this bend. It goes to the right, then to the left, then to the right. How do you bend mountains? God can do that with a flood. Evidence number 5 is sea and land animals that are buried together. So we see this on every continent. We see things like fish, and that fish there is eating his breakfast, so that is rapid burial, and he's buried with land plants. Or you have dinosaurs buried with a fish, or again on the far right, dinosaurs buried with fish in the same strata. So whenever they died and they were buried at exactly the same time. But it gets more interesting because it's found in every strata. So in the lowest layers, you have mixed marine and land. And as you move up in the stratas, you have mixed marine and land. This is Dr. Marcus Ross. He's got a PhD in paleontology. Really smart guy. He knows a lot about things and about science. He studied the mosasaurs for his PhD dissertation. And this is what he says about the mosasaur. He says, mosasaurs are globally distributed, and they're globally distributed on continents. On continents. Looking at these things, you're thinking, what would have the power? What would have the capacity to take the marine world and to throw it onto the continents in such a violent and destructive manner? And the flood makes perfect sense of this. And you can see on the map, for instance, we have mosasaurs on all these different continents, but in South America, in the middle of the continent, or in North America, on the middle of the continent. These are huge beasts. What would have the power to do that? This is Dr. Tim Clary, PhD in geology, and he says we find 6 different species of sharks with the T-Rex in the Hell Creek Formation in eastern Montana. Now, when I think of the T-Rex, I don't think of 6 different species of sharks swimming around the T-Rex. Something in the environment is acting weird here. But look at this. This is Dr. Clare giving a presentation on this, right? So in the Hell Creek Formation, they've got 6 different sharks with over 20 different varieties, species of dinosaurs buried in the same rock layer at the same time. Number 6 is buried trees. The buried trees in rocks. So I want to introduce you to the polystrate fossils, the buried trees in rocks, and specifically a PhD geologist, Dr. Derek Ager. Now, Dr. Derek Ager has passed. He was not a Christian or a Bible-believing scientist. He was a secular geologist, a good man, and he did most of his geology fieldwork back in the 60s and 70s and wrote this famous book in 1981, The Stratigraphic Record. And what he did in that book was challenge the status quo of the uniformitarian method of the past is the key to the present, that everything that's happened currently has always happened at the same rates. He said about these polystrate fossils, trees buried in coal seams, waiting 100,000 years to bury a 30-foot tree would be ridiculous. We cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed. And these are different photographs in his book showing these trees that are buried in coal seams, 300-million-year-old coal seams, Mississippi coal seams. Again, this is Dr. Tim Clary saying, we do not see any signs of roots at all. So you can see here this picture of this tree. There's no root at the bottom. And it's grown up through solid, multiple different strata of rock. Now, if there's no roots at the bottom, the reason why this is so important, that tree was not buried in situ. That's technical speak for it did not grow there. It had been transported and it ended up there somehow. Global flood. This is Dr. Morris again, talking about the polystrate fossils. Missing are the root systems of the trees and all the bark. None of these trees are at present standing upright in the place of growth. Often, upright stumps can be seen penetrating through several layers of coal, shale, siltstone, limestone, all of which are thought to take a long time to accumulate and require totally different environments of deposition. And then my 7th evidence for tonight, and I'll conclude, is the secular geologists, their minds are beginning to change. So I want to introduce you first to Dr. Warren Ullman. He's a secular geologist. He is not only the director of Paleontological Research Institution at Ithaca in New York, but he's also the adjunct associate professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Cornell. Pretty smart guy, right? And just as a side note for a second, how many of us are familiar with a guy named Charles Lyell? He lived about 200 years ago, so he was really old. And he wrote a really famous book called Principles of Geology. Now, I'm going to give you a little homework, right? This is a little self-study. If you're not familiar with Charles Lyell and you're halfway interested in what we're talking about tonight, you got to spend 10 or 15 minutes of self-study learning who that man was, Charles Lyell. He changed what I think everything. When it comes to the flood study, it changed everything. He was Charles Darwin. We all know who Charles Darwin is. He was Charles Darwin's mentor. And in 1830, when he wrote a series of 3 volumes of Principles of Geology, he turned geology upside down. And we are still reaping what he had done. So here we have Dr. Ullman talking about the Charles Lyell. He said, Lyell sold geology some snake oil. He convinced geologists that all past processes acted at the current rates, that is, those observed in historic time. This extreme gradualism has led to numerous unfortunate consequences, including the rejection of sudden or catastrophic events in the face of positive evidence for them, for no other reason than they were not gradual. I dig deeper and I go to the most preeminent paleontologist of the 20th century, Dr. Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University. He's since passed, but he said about Charles Lyell, gradualism was never proved from the rocks by Lyell or Darwin, but was rather imposed as a bias upon nature. It has had a profound negative impact on stifling hypotheses and by closing the minds of professionals towards reasonable, empirical alternatives to the dogma of gradualism. Lyell won with rhetoric what he could not carry with the data. And to just go back to Agar one more time, he says in his book in 1981, "My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into the history is that I have been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, i.e. the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and the political history of their day more than the observations in the field." He digs deeper. In other words, we have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme or what might be termed catastrophic processes. Again, these are secular scientists. They're saying, guys, Lyell and Darwin, this geology thing, they may have gotten it all wrong, or large sections of it. So let's just wrap up with just a little bit more closer to home. This is in 2002. This is here in Texas at Canyon Lake. We had epic flooding, epic rains. And what happened was, you can see the dam of Canyon Lake there. It's overflooding its emergency banks. And we have two secular scientists, Dr. Lamb, Dr. Townsend, publishing after this event in the periodical Nature Geoscience. They said, our traditional view of deep river canyons, and you can see on the bottom the river canyon, our traditional view of deep river canyons, such as Grand Canyon, is that they are carved slowly with regular flow and occasional moderate rushing of rivers that erodes rock over periods of millions of years. Watch this. Such is not always the case, however. You see, that's a little bit of a technical backpedal. Maybe we were wrong about this, because what happened at the canyon is within a couple hours, that rushing water, lots of moving water and sediment, carved out tons of solid rock that was sitting there prior. Imagine if the world was covered for 150 days or more with water. What could happen to this planet? So some resources that we recommend if you want to spend some time to dig a little bit deeper into this. Number one is Carved in Stone. This book is by PhD geologist Timothy Cleary. It is an excellent read. When you read that, the next book you've got to read is The Ice Age. And this talks about and I'm talking about singular, ice age that occurred after the flood. It would have been 500 to 700 years. I'm not talking about multiple ice ages. I'm not talking about 5. I'm not talking about 50,000. I'm talking about a singular ice age that occurred right after the flood event. That book by Dr. Jake Hubert covers that. And then this all really started in the early 60s with the Genesis flood by Dr. Morris and Dr. Whitcomb. Excellent book, but I would start with those first two. And then if you really want to take basically like a graduate course in the flood and geology, the Genesis Flood Revised by Dr. Snelling is just tremendous. It is not a light read, but once you read this, you can answer a lot of flood questions. And then finally, dating, radiometric dating, carbon dating. I think if you go to somebody that has a PhD in nuclear physics, Dr. Cusp's Rethinking Radiometric Dating, that's a good place to start. We do have a QR code here. If you scan that, that'll bring you to a website that I've created. The website URL is epicflood.org. So that's easy to remember, and epicflood.org. There's lots of interviews and documentaries and resources on there. But at this time, me and Rick are going to open it up to Q&A.
Something about 5,700 with the carbon dating, and could you just briefly restate the 5,700 years?
Yeah,
That seems interesting for young Earth, real hardcore young Earthers that kind of think
well, what it says is,
6,000
yeah,
years old.
the half-life of carbon-14 is nitrogen to carbon-14 back to nitrogen. And that half-life in which that occurs is 5,730 plus or minus 40 years or something like that. And what that says is that that's kind of that's the outer limit if you want only a half-life. As I said, most reputable scientists will say you can't really get more than 2 half-lives at the most. Some guys will say since we don't know the starting conditions, even that's a little bit of an exaggeration or an assumption based on a set of assumptions based on other assumptions. And so the point there is you can't get 65 million years out of carbon dating. If somebody tells you, I know dinosaurs existed 65 million years ago because they were carbon dated, what do you know immediately?
They're lying.
They don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand carbon dating. So that was the point of that, yeah. And
Thank you.
it's exact, I mean, hardcore young earthers, if they, you know, if you want to believe 6,000 years, again, we don't know for sure that that half-life is accurate. We don't know the starting conditions, so it could still be within that range. And our point today is not to talk about age of the universe, but to talk about the flood being relatively recent. Whatever happened before that is wiped out by the evidence of the flood.
Jacob had a question.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you guys so much. I think one question I would have is about the, have you heard about, there's these little halos that are like in,
Polonium halos.
1985, Dr. Robert Gentry wrote a book, God's Tiny Fingerprints. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard Dr. Snelling talk about it at incredible length. It is incredible key to understanding uranium-237. You can look at how it degrades. I'm not a PhD chemist or geologist, but listening to the guys that are, once you get down, as uranium-237 degrades, in the rocks, you start to see these polonium halos. They shouldn't be there, but they're there.
What kind of halos?
They're called polonium halos. They have a half-life of about 1.5 seconds.
oh, wow.
And in order for that breakdown chain of events to occur, for that signature to be in the rocks, it shouldn't be there, but it is. And it's not just in sedimentary rock, it's in metamorphic rock. So that's my 60-second answer. I could go on for a long time.
Quick, don't they contain helium as well?
The rocks...
Helium should have dissipated if they're millions or billions of years old as well. So it's another indication that we don't really know that those indicate an old rock per se.
Helium's a very slippery gas, and it should not, as we know with balloons, right? You put helium in a balloon, it's not going to last more than a couple days. This is because it can sneak out. It can sneak out of rocks as well. And when you go into very, very deep rock, which the Institute of Creation Research did over a course of 8 years from 1997 to 2005 in their RAPE project, they dug down all the way down to, deep, deep bedrock, 1.5 billion year old rock, as the secular scientists would date it. And in that rock down there, they found measurable amounts of helium. The point is the helium should have diffused 1.5 billion years ago or sooner. It shouldn't still be there unless the rock is much younger.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of, go ahead, Paul.
Can I just add part two of that question? The question would be, why are they there if they're not supposed to be there? And if they're there, could that be proof that God created out of nothing, that they just appeared seemingly?
So great question. So two things. One, I would say, I think it begs the question that the rock is not 1.5 billion years old. And it's 1.5 to 3 billion years old. There's a little bit of wiggle room there.
Yeah.
But that helium should not be there in the zircon crystals that are embedded in that rock. And then number two, sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Just why, as you say, they're not supposed to be there. Why? The question is just why are they there? So is that possible proof that God created out of nothing, that it just appeared? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm suggesting, it's not proof, but what I'm suggesting is if the planet is young, then that is an argument for why the helium is still there. Oh, that makes sense. If that rock is 1.5 to 3 billion years old, as the daters say it is, then the helium shouldn't be there. But we know the helium is because they bored it out, brought it in the lab, tested the zircon crystals, and there was measurable amounts of helium that shouldn't be there. And that was just one of numerous evidences.
These subduction zones we talked about, where you've got these tectonic plates coming together, incredible heat and pressure, we can't simulate that. We can mathematically calculate what it might have been by estimation. We don't have any conditions like that we can really replicate to see what would have caused these things to form. But there were probably a lot of things that look really old that happened during the flood that were much more recent than we think, because we just don't know what those conditions could produce.
Charles.
I've heard also that on the polonium halos that they occur in granites. And so one of the reasons why it's important for the age issue is that the traditional thought is that granite slowly cooled over a long, long period of time. If that's the case, polonium halos with such a short half-life, should those rings of discoloration shouldn't still be there.
Shouldn't
They
be
would
there.
have dissipated entirely, but there they are, which suggests that the granite was created much more rapidly, maybe instantaneously.
Last question, and I'll ask it.
Okay.
I was talking to a petroleum engineer, and I said, why are there petroleum deposits that are 2, 3, 4,000 or more feet down? How did they get there? Right? Because that had to be a carbon source that turned into petroleum over time through heat and pressure. And he said, well, there was a flood. There was a flood and they got buried. So my question to you is, in human history, do we ever see floods that deposit material any more than hundreds of feet, let alone 2, 3, 4,000 feet? Can we point to anything in history that is that deep of a flood? Does that make sense to you? Flood deposit.
I would say short answer is no. Mount St. Helens is a smaller example.
Right.
But no, there's no other cataclysmic event that could have buried thousands of feet of sediment on top of organic material.
Right.
So it seems to be a one of a kind.
Yeah, it does. Go ahead, Alex. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
So also, it's not necessarily universal thought that it was from biological sources at all anymore, because hydrocarbons appear in, for instance, Jupiter's moons. Has one of them has an underground sea of hydrocarbons, like similar to crude oil. So it isn't necessarily a universally agreed upon thing anymore, because science can get things wrong for all sorts of different reasons, but it could be that the initial assumption that it was biological at all could be in doubt.
I'm going to follow up with you and get your resource.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I read a number of years ago that idea was coming about, and I haven't done research to see what the thinking is currently, but the idea that magma may be a source of the hydrocarbons that we see in these huge gas deposits. So it may be a relatively infinite source of gas, which is a good thing,
That's a good thing.
but
yeah.
we don't know.
Let's give it up for these guys.
Thanks, guys.